Carolina. I'm really excited to welcome you here to our uh, our disparities research and methods seminar series. And today we're really pleased to have Dr. Caitlin Allen, who is a recent graduate, a newly minted PhD from the Department of Behavioral, Social, and Health Education Sciences at Emory University at the Rolling School of Public Health. So Caitlin has a really impressive background, and she has been working uh, as a doctoral student before finishing her PhD at MUSC with the Biomedical Informatics Center here at MUSC, and has really done some, I think, really important and groundbreaking work related to understanding family health history. Caitlin also applied for and received a highly competitive NCI F99 KOO. And she's going to be talking with us today about her journey. So we're super excited because in addition to doing some of her pre-doctoral work here at MUSC, Caitlin will be joining the Medical University of South Carolina in a couple of weeks or months, Caitlin. As a postdoctoral faculty member, so a postdoctoral fellow. So we're super excited and welcome and look forward to hearing about her experiences applying and writing a K99 and FOO. So Caitlin, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Shanita. I think that's one of the first times I've publicly been called doctor, so it's nice to hear. As Shanita mentioned, I have finished all of my requirements at Emory for my PhD and will be starting the KOO phase of my career, the postdoctoral phase at MUSC on June 1. So thank you all for coming to hear me speak today. What I was asked to talk about was sort of a hybrid focus here. So the title of my presentation is The Inside Scoop on Experiences Applying for the F99 KOO and My Journey with Grant Writing. And so I want to provide with some information about my research journey and the process of receiving the F99 KOO, just information for any of you who are either planning to apply for this type of award or have mentees that might be candidates for this type of award. And then I also want to share a bit about my own research and as it relates to the F99 KOO and more broadly, my research trajectory. So I'll start, these are the objectives that I have for a presentation today. I want to start by sharing a little bit about my program of research and research focus. As Shanita mentioned, what I've been doing with MUSC and at Emory. I will also provide an overview of my experiences with grant writing, including both successes and failures in the process and the many failures that have led toward where I am now. I'm going to talk specifically about the F99 KOO mechanism, which is currently offered through the NCI, and I believe has also expanded to some other institutes within the NIH. I will plan to share some high-level tips and resources for grant writing, and then finally be available to answer questions about the grant writing process specific to the F99 KOO and my research. So I will say, I think we're kind of on the smaller side today as far as attendees. So please feel free to stop me at any point or type into the chat. I have that open if you have questions, comments, or thoughts throughout my presentation. There are a few polling questions that I have. We'll see if those work. And if not, we will go ahead and do that through the chat as well. And then I do have a couple of sort of activities or things that I would like for you all to participate in throughout. So I hope you're willing to play along with me on those. So before you hear more about me, I'd love to hear a little bit about who you are as the audience. And so I'm going to try to open this poll and let's see if it works. Okay, so I think I've launched a poll. I'm not actually able to see it, but it's asking your status as either if you're a student, a faculty member, clinician, community member. And if, please let me know if you're unable to answer these questions. Looks like we need a couple more to participate if they're able. Great. All right. Well, thank you for answering these questions. I'm going to end our polling and hopefully you all can see the results, but we have a fair number of clinicians on the call today, one predoctoral student, community member, faculty members, nice mix of individuals. The majority of you have it's a mixed bag here with people applying to 0 grants and then about half of you applying to 3 or more grants. The types of grants that you've applied to are primarily internal or federal, so quite a split there as well with that. And then the number of grants received is either 0 or 3 or more, so many. And we'll talk a little bit more about those last few questions with the types and number of grants you've applied to. All right, and are you all able to see the results now? Someone could. All right. I got a thumbs up, okay. So I'd like to start by sharing more about my program of research, and this is in part to help you get to know me, but also really to help emphasize the importance of being able to communicate who you are and where you're going when writing grants, especially as an early career researcher. And this was something that I'll talk about when applying to the F31 and then also the F99 KOO that I think was really strategic and really important for me to be able to better speak about my research, to better speak about who I am as a professional and academic, and then kind of where I seek to go in the future. So these 3 statements are first, how I define myself broadly. The second statement, which I'll read, is something that is directly lifted from my F99 KOO. And then the third is how I'm going about doing my research. And so broadly, I would say that I am a social and behavioral scientist focused on the implementation of evidence-based practices to reduce disparities in cancer prevention, control, and treatment. So high level. And then, like I said, this next statement is something that I lifted directly from my F99 KOO application. My career goal is to develop a program of research focused on how to optimally implement existing evidence-based solutions in cancer prevention and early detection. So long-term, having a vision of where I seek to go in my career. And then the way that I do this is in that current evidence-based solution is through family health history research and better understanding how family health history information can inform risk stratified cancer prevention and tailored screening approaches. And I'm particularly focused on African American families in my body of research for the F99 KOO. And so the ways that I've researched family health history sort of falls into 2 categories. First is around the integration of community health workers in public health and healthcare settings. And then the second is around the use of family health history tools. So I'm going to talk about each of these now. And again, the way that I spoke about my research and the way that I spoke about my career goals in my application, federal application. So community health workers is sort of the first area that I've area I've been focusing on for almost a decade now, working with community health workers to conduct research and as disseminators of interventions. And so for those who aren't familiar, community health workers or patient navigators are individuals who bridge the gap between the community and clinic. And there is much evidence and much support for community health workers in delivering public health and clinical interventions. We see that this in many chronic diseases and evidence and support from the CDC and other federal agencies for integrating community health workers into healthcare and public health settings. But there have been sort of limited efforts to incorporate community health workers into precision type of work, precision public health and family health history in particular. And so my research to date has looked at ways that we can support community health workers to potentially complete family health history information alongside patients and then better incorporate that into their medical records and ensure that the information will inform risk stratified prevention. So I've conducted qualitative work to understand CHW's perceptions of family health history, how they're engaged, and potential training needs in this area. I've also developed a kin-keeping behavior scale. This was part of my dissertation that community health workers could potentially use to help identify those in the family who might be more knowledgeable of family health history information, and then work with them to complete family health history. And in the KOO phase, my postdoctoral work, I plan to further work with community health workers to try to implement family health history tools into community oncology and primary care settings. So, like I said, I've worked with community health workers and done this type of research for quite some time, and then have gradually shifted with my research interest in cancer and family health history into thinking about how community health workers can be part of improving family health history communication. The second area that ties into my work is around the use of family health history tools. And we have probably all completed a family health history at some point with our provider. And there are also many publicly available family health history tools. The Surgeon General has one, now supported by CDC, and sort of these large campaigns to improve family health history knowledge and collection. So I completed in this line of research a systematic evaluation of existing publicly available family health history tools. I used the diffusion of innovations as a framework. So thinking about if the tools have considered what we know to be best practice in designing tools to better disseminate and get them out to the public. I also have looked at public perceptions of the importance of family health information and the levels of trust in family networks to provide accurate information about their health. Finding that this was using the HINTS, NCI HINTS database, and finding that many people actually do not trust their family members in providing health information to them. And then my future and the kind of focus of my is going to be to develop a family health history collection tool. And this will be using It Runs in My Family, which is specifically designed to collect hereditary cancer information. It was developed at MUSC by Brandon Welch and his team. And so we'll be working with them and with human-centered design principles to improve the tool, which will then be delivered in the clinical setting and community settings. So I'm going to pause here and see if anyone has questions. You're welcome to chat the questions or come off of mute to see if anyone has questions about my research in general or some of the findings that I've presented at a very high level.
Caitlin, this is Shanita. One of the things that I think about is what we should how we can disseminate these tools that are evidence-based. And I know you have an interest in dissemination and implementation science. But one of the things that struck me as I've gone to the Surgeon General's website is just how cumbersome those forms are.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you were going to talk about that as part of your presentation.
I can talk about it a little bit now. So yes, the tools themselves are quite cumbersome, and I know we have many clinicians here on the call, so it's kind of, I'd be interested to hear their perspective as well. But you know, in order to have enough information to inform clinical decision making and risk stratified approaches, you do need a lot of detail about age and diagnosis, et cetera, et cetera. So it's kind of this balance of trying to get all of that really detailed information, but then put it into a format that the user can provide it in a simple way.
Mm-hmm.
And so the current publicly available tools just are cumbersome. They go through family member by family member and ask question by question, sort of about every single person in your family. And so I think there's some issues with the flow of how questions are asked, as well as the design and the look of the website itself. So those are the types of questions that I'll be hoping to answer and improve in the first aim of my KOO, and thinking about how to both better ask the questions and have a better flow of question asking, as well as just the look and feel of the types of tools.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. I'll go ahead and move on. So I'm going to come back to sort of the grant writing piece here and go back to these 3 statements that I gave you all earlier, which started with who I am as a social and behavioral scientist, focus on implementation of evidence-based practices. My career or research program and career goal for me, because I'm focused on this F99 KOO piece, and then the how. And I know there may be a handful of you here that might actually apply to a fellowship type of award, but what I was hoping to do, and I'll type this in the chat, is to have you all think a little bit about the way that you would define your research, right? If you were to need to articulate who you are in a grant application, how would you do that? If you were to need to articulate for a career research type of award application, how would you articulate your career goal or your research, the goal of your research program? That's the second statement. And then how are you going about achieving that career goal? And so I'm going to go ahead and just type these in the chat here for you all to think about. If anyone has these kind of statements top of mind that you already are using in your work, please feel free to include them in the chat. And I'll also circle back and hope that some folks might be willing to share how they might describe who they are, their program of research or their career goals if you're in that stage of your career, and then the how. So let me just take a minute here. Great. Thank you, Shanita, for sharing. So your kind of high level statement, I am a behavioral scientist focused on conducting translational research to promote equity in healthcare and outcomes in minority and medically underserved populations. Great. So yeah, I would encourage you all to sort of be thinking about this. Feel free to share in the chat, would love to hear more from you all throughout the presentation. All right, so now I'm going to jump a little bit more deeply into my experience in grant writing. And this is my second objective, where I want to share my experience both with the federal and non-federal grant writing process. And really here, I would like to emphasize the successes and also the failures around the grant writing process. I know some of you have applied to a number of grants and some of you have never applied to grants. So it's kind of a range here. And so would like to just give a transparent picture of the process that I went through, and I think is pretty typical of individuals who are in a similar career stage. So I'm going to skip over these polling questions since we already did them, which included how many grants you've applied to, the types of grants, which was split kind of institutional and federal, and then the number of grants that you've received. So I'll start here with my success, right? And so if you were to see the most recent news and information and just come to this presentation, then you would see that I received an F99 KOO award and that I was the first in my department, et cetera, right? And that's wonderful and true, but I also think it's important to know that there is a whole list of failures, right? There's a whole, I don't know if you've seen this type of, this article in Nature, but there's a CV of failures behind what has happened to each of us in our careers, right? Things that we've applied to and didn't receive. And so I'm going to go through my CV of failures and share a little bit more about that. If you're interested in this idea, I think it's something that has really been nice for me as a mentee to sort of remember that when we see high achieving people, they have this, this whole trajectory that they've gone through. And so if you Google CV of failures, you can find information about this. But this is a CV from a professor at Princeton who published his career failures on Twitter. And this was really an attempt to balance the record and encourage others to keep trying even in the face of disappointment. And so I think it's funny and, it's cheeky in a sense, but it also sort of puts perspective on everything. So this is the timeline that I went through in order to get to where I am now with finishing up the F99 phase and beginning the KOO. So just to give you a sense, I began my PhD program in 2017. And I went through and applied for quite a number of seed grants or small institutional grants that were, I think, really fundamental in developing my research interest, giving me a little bit of data and information to then to include in all of my fellowship applications, and kind of demonstrates that I can apply to and receive funding and that I'm responsible with that funding. So I think that's a really important takeaway here is to continue to build your resume with these smaller seed grants, institutional grants, and things like that to move forward with supporting the larger mechanisms, even at the doctoral or postdoctoral level. So I began my PhD program and I very quickly applied to the F31 mechanism. And I imagine many of you are familiar with the F31 mechanism, as it's something that many doctoral and clinical clinicians would apply to support their research. I applied to that in December of 2018. I received my score a few months later, and it was not good. It was not fundable, and it was very disappointing. Posting up here my file and impact score, and I'll actually share with you more about the summary statement from that F31. I then applied to the F99 KOO in December of the following year. I had the option of resubmitting my F31, and I chose not to do that and instead go ahead and apply for the F99 KOO. This requires an institutional nomination letter. So there's only one individual who can be nominated and put forward by each institution. So that was a process that I had to go through and receive Emory's support for me to apply to the F99 KOO. I then received my score in April of last year and did much better on this application and was awarded the F99 KOO in August of 2020. So that's been funding my work ever since. I'm going to go into more detail about kind of this transition and changes that I made between the F31 and F99 KOO and some other information about the grant process, but I'll pause here and see if you all have questions about the timeline or CV of failures or anything that I've touched on so far. Okay. And I see, great, I see some additional kind of who you are, and we'll touch on those in a little bit. Thank you for sharing in the chat. Okay, so I am posting here my summary statements for both of my grant applications, and I'm posting these to highlight how things shifted between the two awards. So in the first, I'll let you take a minute to sort of read through the F31 and F99 as I'm talking, but the things that I want to highlight here is how the reviewers perceived my work in the F31 in comparison to the F99. And so if you read the first sentence of each of these statements, you'll see, I think, similar language, but a different understanding between the reviewers. So in the F31, which received a score that was not fundable, they wrote, this application requests support for training in cancer health disparities and public health genomics and research that addresses family cancer history gathering among African-American families by community health workers. In my second attempt in the F99, they said, this fellowship candidate proposes training in cancer health disparities with a focus on translation of evidence-based genetics applications such as family cancer history collection to improve risk stratified cancer prevention and early detection in underserved minority populations. So there's similar language included here, but I think a big difference that when I was reflecting back on this is that I think the reviewers in the F31, I wasn't able to articulate the why of my research compared to the F99. In the first sentence, they are writing the why that my research matters. So it says, that the reason that I'm doing this is to improve risk stratified cancer prevention and early detection. So I think that is a big shift that I had between the two applications, where in the F31, I was trying to articulate and cram everything in to my application, my 6-page application, right? All parts of my dissertation, all parts of who I am. And I put a ton of information into a small space. And I think I missed sort of being able to articulate the bigger picture of why this matters, because I was trying to articulate why my research matters for all of public health ever, as opposed to sort of taking a smaller slice and really diving in, being clear and explicit about the why for this particular application. I also think a big change between the F31 and F99 KOO was that I thought really specifically about the reviewers. And in my F31, I didn't care so much about who the reviewers were. And I felt like people should think that my work is important simply because it is important. And then I didn't articulate why very well. But in the F99, I understood that the reviewers for this award are primarily basic scientists, and they're primarily clinicians, and they're really not behavioral scientists that are sitting on this panel. And so I was very careful to articulate my work in a way that I thought would be well received by these reviewers and understood by them. And so I think those are some strategies that were really helpful in that shift and in moving from a non-fundable score to a very good score. The other area that I'd like to emphasize in this summary statement is the training plan. And so the training plan, for those of you who are not familiar with these mechanisms, is super, super important. And I thought I had done a good job in the F31 around developing a training plan, but you can read here that says the training plan includes relevant activities to broaden the applicant's skills and expertise, but is overly ambitious. It lacked sufficient emphasis on social network analysis, intervention development, and advanced statistical techniques. And it had coursework that was not well aligned with my stated research interests. My F99 statement says that my training plan is clear and logical. It has sufficient details. It is well aligned with clear steps, shifting me from the F99 to the KOO, including a focus on translation between bench, clinical, community, and a strong and detailed plan for choosing an institution. So I'm going to show you what I did in my training plan for the F99, but you can just see here that I, again, was kind of being overly ambitious and putting out so much information in that F31 in comparison to really honing in for the F99 component. I'm going to pause here again and see if there are any questions, and I'll take a look at the chat as well. Shanita, you asked, why did you decide not to resubmit the F31, and how did this application inform the F99 KOO? I decided not to resubmit the F31 because I felt like the time it would have taken for me to respond to the reviewers and resubmit by August I didn't feel like I was able to respond to some of the reviewers' concerns. They had concerns about my sample size, and they were really focused on my research, which I think is partially the type of mechanism. The F31 is really focused on funding the research itself. And so I was also just exhausted and thinking about the F31 and had such disappointment around that, that score, et cetera, that I said, I'm just going to take a break here. And so I think then the F99, what I think a big difference is between the two mechanisms, and I'll compare these in just a minute, is that the F99 KOO, it does focus on your research, but it also is funding you as a researcher long-term, right? So they're giving you up to 6 years of funding, and they care about your dissertation work, but it's not as much of a focus on the nitty-gritty of the statistical methods and the research itself. It's really saying, oh, this person can and will be successful in the area of cancer research. So they're saying, I put my trust in me as a researcher, as opposed to funding that specific line of research itself. So I hope that nuance is making sense to you all, but I think that that's partially a difference between the mechanisms and a difference in how I went about approaching this. Okay. So one other point I want to make before moving on to my next objective is the importance of planning and organizing for these awards. And as a early career person, as a doctoral student, this was something that, if you're more senior, you probably have a little more support in pulling together applications. But for me, in my experience, I was the administrator, I was the grant writer. I mean, you're kind of putting on all the hats and learning as you're going. And so I did, of course, have a grant administration team to submit the application, but there were many, many parts that are unique to these types of fellowships, which include getting letters of recommendation, putting together different letters of support, which are unique from letters of recommendation, getting the nomination letter, et cetera. So there's a lot of moving parts. And for many, this is a first time doing this type of grant submission. And so I would just encourage those who are in an early career stage to work very closely with your mentor to put together sort of a Gantt chart or a timeline and work backwards from the submission date. And for mentors, be able to support your mentees in this process. But I would say, it was really important for me to learn some of the lessons the hard way and sort of do the work and wear those multiple hats. So just wanted to bring that up as something for you all to consider, no matter where you are in your career trajectory. Now I'd like to share a little bit more about the F99 KOO as an award. So, okay. So I've been talking about my F31 and F99 KOO. With the F99 KOO, this was at the time only offered through the National Cancer Institute. I've mentioned, I think it's open to a few other institutes now, but you'd have to look online and check. But NCI has been the most long-standing institute for this award. Versus the F31, it's offered through various NIH. I think almost every NIH program has an F31. With the F99 KOO, I mentioned this earlier when answering Shanita's question, it's a transitional award. And so it does care about your research, but it's really rewarding your future research and aspirations. And so that's where I was emphasizing the importance of being able to articulate your past and also future ideas, and be able to demonstrate how you plan to become a cancer researcher very, very clearly. Versus the F31, I think is primarily a dissertation completion fellowship. There are also postdocs for F32, and that's much more science focused and heavy on making sure that your methods are very clear, and that your science is very clear. They care about who you are as a researcher, but the emphasis is a little less on that area because they're only funding you for a year or two versus the F99 KOO, which funds you for up to 6 years. Another big difference is that the F99 KOO, you must be nominated by your institution. There's one per institution. I think this is super important. I had to do a lot of work at Emory to become nominated. They had only ever nominated basic scientists. So that was a big push for me to say, hey, I'm a behavioral scientist and I really think I deserve this nomination. But it also comes with the backing of your institution. So there are fewer applicants overall, whereas the F31 could be any number of hundreds and hundreds of people because multiple individuals from an institution can apply. Both F99 KOO and F31 are focused on training opportunities and mentorship, with the F99 being a little bit more focused on how you're going to transition between the F99 and KOO and laying out a very clear plan for that. And then finally, the two both require recommenders. There are up to 5 that are submitted submitted not anonymously, but they're submitted by the recommender. So minimum of 3, maximum of 5. And those are just a part of the process that I think are really important. And both times in my summary statements, the reviewers commented on the quality of my recommendation letters. So this is a little bit more detail about the components of the F99. All of this is laid out on the NCI's website, and I just wanted to highlight a few areas that I think are particularly important. So you need to have an institutional nomination letter. The process for your institution nominating you happens at least a month in advance, if not multiple months in advance. For me, I had to apply to become nominated in September of 2020. Yeah, September of 2020. And then the application was not due into the NCI until December of 2020. However, I did not find out I was nominated by Emory until very, very late October. I want to say Halloween time is when I found out. And so I had about a month to go ahead and apply for the F99 KOO. That said, one thing that was helpful was that I already had many of the components because of the F31. So if you as a student or as a mentor are planning on supporting someone to apply for this award and going through that institutional nomination process, I do think it's worthwhile to start getting your ducks in a row and planning while you're waiting to hear if you've been nominated by the institution. The award has a fellowship applicant section, which includes information about your dissertation, experience, training goals and objectives, and activities. This award. There are specific ways that you write your specific aims so that you're touching on both your past, your dissertation work and your future work. And then you have a research training plan, which again is divided into the F99 KOO. I wanted to share a sample directly from my my application, which shows how I talked about each of the years in my award, and went through F99, breaking down how I would go about research, coursework, scientific writing, teaching and mentoring, and then the total effort. This type of table was really well received by the grant committee because they want to see that you're going to primarily be focusing your time on research and not have your time taken up by teaching, for example. I also think that this table 3, I cut off most of it, but you can see that I went through each training goal, which was also in the narrative, and specified how those training goals would take place in my F99 year. And then I also have the KOO years, 4 years of the KOO divided up with the training goals listed there as well. And these training goals in the grant narrative are very directly tied to my specific aims. Okay, so I'll go ahead and pause here again and see if you all have any questions for me about what I've shared. And then I would like, if not, then I would like read some of the responses that you all had in the chat for who you are, your program of research, and how you're doing. So let's see. All right, so I see my career goal is to develop a translational program of research that identifies biopsychological pathways involved in health promotion and disease risk behaviors. Great. We have another that's, I'm a recent PhD nursing scientist graduate from UMass Amherst and master's prepared clinical exercise physiologist with a strong translational research interest in adolescents and young adult cancer survivorship and symptom self-management. My research aims are to improve the quality of life of cancer survivors through wellness-based biobehavioral life sessions at all stages of the cancer care continuum, incorporate interdisciplinary approaches to symptoms management, mitigate cancer health disparities by harnessing clinical and community partnerships, and use innovative methods in the assessment, intervention, and evaluation of biopsychological health outcomes in cancer. Great. We have another, I'm a medical oncologist looking at ways to improve cancer outcomes in African Americans. Great, thank you all for sharing those. So I wanted to close with a few additional tips and resources, and then we can open it up for any further questions or comments. So my first tip is to use the NIH reporter. I think this is something that as an early career person, I've taken to using quite a bit. I don't know if it's promoted. I don't know how people think of it, but I feel like it's often forgotten, at least for me. So go in and use the NIH reporter to find other applicants who have been successful in your line of research for that particular grant. It was very difficult for me to find grant individuals who were in the behavioral and social sciences that had received the F99 KOO. But when I did, I reached out to them and they were more than happy to share their experience with me. And I think that that was very critical for me being successful in this process. I also think the NIH reporter is useful when you're trying to identify possible KOO institutions. And I actually went through and identified mentors and possible places that I could go. So I used that to see who the researchers would be that I could collaborate with in the future. I would also recommend contacting awardees at your institution. So if once you receive the nomination, assuming your institution has done this before, you can collaborate with and talk to others who have received the award. So at Emory, we've had a very good trajectory of success for nominees, and the previous applicants were basic scientists, but I still was able to speak with them and understand some of the nuances of the award. I mentioned this before when I was talking about the CV of failures, but that, you know, there is really value to having small grants and small wins along the way in order to better shape your research interest and be able to hone how you talk about your work and demonstrate that you are able to apply for and receive grant funding. I also think that it's important to make sure that what you're applying for directly matches what you need, right? And so thinking through that, not just at the fellowship level, I think this is across the board, right? But in particular with these types of mechanisms, do you really need an F31 to support your dissertation work? Or do you have institutional funding that might be able to do that for you? So just really knowing the ins and outs of the grant before applying to it, so that you're able to make sure it makes sense for you, and also make sure that you're answering all the different parts of it and being really responsive to the application. And then finally, to take critiques that you receive, as I demonstrated with my summary statements, and try to improve your future submissions. So I'll stop here and thank you all for your time, your participation, and I'm happy to provide any answers to questions or have a conversation.
Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for being so open and honest about your experiences. You know, when you talked about your CV of failures, you know, one of the things I have shared with family members is that I get some form of rejection almost every day.
Yeah.
And, you know, but what it does, I think what you, the point that you made, it really emphasized the importance of perseverance and resilience, and, you know, taking the rejections from manuscripts and grants, and rejection's not the right word, I'm struggling for the right word, but take them as setbacks and not as rejections or failures, because it is an opportunity to learn from and improve upon the quality of your science. So, and I think, you know, I would just echo your point about the importance of applying for internal awards, because it does give you an important experience with respect to building your own trajectory. So one question I had for you is, as you think about your transition now into a postdoc, I know that's really sort of right in front of you at the moment. How have you thought about have you thought at all about your transition into a faculty position, and where and how that would look like? And what are some of the things that, so I think we sort of, you know, build upon, you know, our experience. One thing, I gave a talk recently at the National Institute of Nursing Research, and the person who was coordinating the seminar said, you know, I've been following your career, and I sort of see how your research has grown over years. I said, well, you see a lot of failures in there. She said, well, no, you can really see like how you've, you know, matured over a period of time. And I wonder, you know, if now that you're at a really exciting point in your career, because you finished your dissertation, your PhD, you're now sort of at the beginning of the next phase. So how have you been thinking about that, and how to leverage all of your other work to help you facilitate that process?
Yeah, I think a couple of thoughts is making sure that that statement about who I am and my career goals, that I keep coming back to that, right? And as I move into postdoctoral work, and I would say this even as I had started my dissertation, you often feel like you're a kid in a candy shop, right? And there's so many potential opportunities when you're starting these new these new positions. And so really making sure that anything that I'm sort of moving me in the direction of being a behavioral and social scientist that cares about cancer disparities, et cetera, and being thoughtful with the types of collaborators and collaborations that I have and the mentors and teams that I'm aligned with. So I think that's one thing that's really important. And then I would say I need to start kind of assessing, as far as future faculty positions, assessing whether it makes sense for me to be applying to something like another transition award, which there's the K to R, right? And that's another mentored type of award, or whether it makes sense for me to go ahead and say, I think I'm ready to do an R21. I think I'm ready to do some smaller award that is not necessarily mentored. And do I really need more training in these new areas, or can I take what I've learned and now apply it and kind of go along that line of research? So I think that's to be determined, but that's where that division between the F31 really showed up, with it being about your research versus about you as a career cancer researcher. So those are things that I've been thinking.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions for Caitlin? Well, I'll bring the seminar to a close again by thanking Caitlin for such a insightful and thought-provoking presentation. As I said earlier, Caitlin is joining MUSC in a couple of weeks. So she put her Emory email address on there, but will you have your same MUSC email?
Yeah, I will. I'll go ahead and type it into the chat. I'll type my Emory just because that's what I know off the top of my head. And then yeah. And you're welcome to contact me that way.
Okay, great. So thanks again, Caitlin, and thanks everyone for joining. We'll see you the next time. Bye.
Mm-hmm.